Hello, folks. This is the video from, I guess, the fourth week of class, and I just wanted to give you guys a chance to take a look at it. It's going to be a short one because I've sped up the video. But as you might remember, we started talking about at the beginning of class about the design of the piece, that we could crop images, whether we're doing them from an image like this or from life, and to look at it in terms of the shapes and the repetition of shapes. We might also see repetitions of color and things like that while we're looking at it, because as we start to crop it and play with it, we start to see things a little bit more. We notice, we don't take things for granted because we're seeing bits and pieces. Here I then moved over to doing some short shape studies, just trying to get a sense of what I wanted to do. Did a quick value study as well, just trying to get 3 or 4 values, and then moved from doing little small studies to actually getting a drawing down, drawing fairly loosely, not worrying too much about the details at first, but get the format laid out, start putting the major shapes into that format. I guess the next thing I'm going to, as you'll watch me do this a little bit, you'll begin to see that what I'm trying to come up with is the major shapes, of course, and getting the proportions basically right, and looking for repetitions of shapes that I might not have noticed at first. And even as I'm doing this, I'm still thinking about, and I guess what kind of color do I want to work with? What colors am I seeing? What repetitions of shape, color, lights and darks, which of course I've already done in these little thumbnails off to the side. And as I begin to get close to finishing this, the pencil work, and you don't always have to do a pencil work, but it can be helpful, particularly if you're just getting started at doing watercolors. But the next thing I'm going to start to think about here is to begin to play with ideas about how I might begin to paint this. So you start to pre-think it a little bit. And then the next thing I want to start to do is to go over to my palette and start to mix some color a little bit, and maybe do a quick color exploration. Just not so much a little study of color of the individual shapes of the color, but rather taking a look at the colors that are there and maybe how to mix them a bit. At that point, I want to start laying in my first 2 colors. I noticed that most of the colors were yellows and blue-greens, and so I started to lay in yellow at first, a very light wash, and started from there to add in extra yellows, sort of building up some of the yellows. And then after that began to get mostly dry, to start mixing up blues and blue-greens. I tend to start places where I think it might be lighter, of course. You tend to start light and move to richer color. Here I'm working across that top edge and trying to not get a big dark puddle of blue. I'm wanting to stretch it across, but of course I'm painting around a yellow shape, so I don't want to leave all of that there. I'm not trying to keep painting that corner. I'm just trying to drag the color out. Here are some of the colors going into white, over the white, but also going in over some of the yellows, so that I'm beginning to start to get some sense of greens by the pale blue going over the yellow. As I do this, I'm trying to think about where do I want things darker, where do I want things to move in more of a golden yellow and blue color, so that it's a kind of a rich yellow-green when it's finished. Or I'm starting to think also about where does the darker, richer blue come in, making the greens very dark and very blue or very cool. And of course down here near the bottom, there's a number of places where there's rich reds and rich golden orange kind of colors and some dark browns. But I'm still playing with achieving lots of blues and blue grays. Sometimes I'll come in here, as you see me working across that bottom bit, adding lines of color, knowing that they're not going to be mostly that color, but getting a sense of some detail and major shapes, major movements, major lines that I'm beginning to sense as we work through this. going back in, of course, to add more blue, but also to enrich the blue, get it darker in some places, begin to get some of the, I won't call them details, but some of the smaller shapes. And here, yes, I'm coming back in over the lighter blues, making some areas darker, getting in some sense of small shapes. There was trees on those hilltops and across the mountains in the back. In fact, I've actually, as I've done this, I've basically gotten rid of almost all the sky. It's just the layers of mountains moving back across. So as the yellow and the blues have dried, and you can see that some of them have turned kind of green, I start to then go back in, starting to move color from just being the duochrome of warm and cool. But first I'm going to enrich the yellows. I'll enrich the blues in certain places and begin to develop the harmonies of greens that need to be developed for this entire piece. It's got a lot of green. So I'm going to let it go for a minute or two and let you just watch what I was doing. Some of this I did after you guys left. So let you take a look. You notice the color on the palette, I'm getting much more of a golden orange, shifting the yellows. Particularly on this little section up front where there's a lot of golden light. And then some of those same colors were up in the building itself. It's in the center. I won't call it an island, but it's over that little hill that's where the house and the compound seems to be built. This is probably a section I should, I won't say delete, but speed up even faster. But you can see I'm still drawing with color as I add in. I'm going for an orange, but then I dull the orange to get slightly more gray orange. But notice it's on top of the yellow, it still comes off. It's kind of a rich orange. But as it goes across the blue and the orangey brown mix together and trying to create a dark neutral. And here I'm actually making a darker neutral, actually dropping in some violet into it, so that when I come back in a moment, see, adding green to the violet, strange choice, but getting just a very earthy green that has a lot of orange and reds in it. And now pushing with a lot more red, now it's a very dull red. It's a very complex red because it's got violet, it's got blue, it's got green in it. But using that to draw with, much like you would with a dark pencil or anything else. So here I'm just barely touching that color on top of the yellows, top of the greens, so that it doesn't read as a dark brown. It just reads as a brown coloration. Sometimes wiping the brush off, of course, shifting the color a little bit more. I told you that I keep a brush of a towel in my hand almost all the time, but sometimes the brush has got too much color, or it's too wet, or it's too dry. So I can shift little bits here and there. And sometimes I have to reach in really quick to pull color out that's in the wrong place, or where I just made a silly mistake. Here I'm moving into that central section where it's sort of the middle of the composition. Just adding it too dark, so I've got to wait for some other things there to dry so that I can do some accurate mark making. And now I'm just going back into the mountain that's in the very far back, creating a little bit of a sense of the mountain or the hills that are closer to us. Now that middle area is going to dry a little bit more, so I can start adding more of the dark greens to the trees and the side of the hill. The shadowed side of the hill that comes down. goes behind the line of, I'm guessing, hay or wheat. It's on a closer hillside. And while it's green, it's a really dark green part. So pushing it really, really dark. And also coming back around to those, I guess they're cypress trees. Some kind of dark evergreen. A lot of times I find that after I've gotten halfway in or two-thirds of the way into the painting, I then sort of jump to some real darks. You sort of think of traditional watercolor as you sneak up on the dark, but eventually I find myself wanting to push the darks a little bit stronger, make the jump, so that things become a little bit, I sort of commit to where the darks are and push myself so that I don't sneak up on everything completely. So I begin to pull a sense of being the full lights and darks all the way around the painting. The idea of being that if I sneak up on things too much for too long, it ends up happening that it's not, it just doesn't, it looks, I guess I'm going to say, it tends to start to look wimpy, and I might not finish it. So if I don't jump in and sort of push some of my color, some of my values, the value of my color, at some point, I might not go as far as I should go. Sorry about, I don't know why I put the hat back on after you guys left. It's in the way, you can't see it. I apologize about that. Yeah, see, you can't see what I'm doing. Silly me. Wasn't paying attention to that. I throw my hat back on my head. I should definitely remove this part. Notice I'm using that same brush over and over again. It's almost my favorite, one of my favorite brushes. It's it and another one that's very similar to it. Thin layers, making some areas darker. I remember when as I was working, that bottom right corner was giving me some trouble. I was trying to decide what to do, kept pushing and thinking. I also remember thinking as I looked up at the picture of the photograph up there, I kept thinking, well, you know, this left-hand side is looking really green, but not green enough in terms of my painting. And also some of the golden colors up there in the fields weren't looking as strong as I wanted them to. And thinking about how gold did I want to go. This is when it's almost finished. Afterwards, I did erase a lot of the lines out, and I touched it up just a few more times after this last image. But thanks for being here, guys.